Ladies and gentlemen, there are moments in life when everything seems fine. The sun rises. The body is healthy. The world around you hums quietly without threat. And yet in the midst of all this apparent calm, you feel tension, anxiety, restlessness. You suffer, even when nothing is wrong. This suffering is not a mystery. It is not a flaw in your circumstances, and it is not a punishment. It arises from the mind itself, from patterns and habits that have been cultivated over a lifetime. The mind is trained to anticipate danger, to chase desire, to compare, to judge. It does not rest easily. In silence, it invents problems. In comfort, it manufactures worry. In freedom, it seeks certainty. Suffering, then, often has nothing to do with the world and everything to do with how the mind interprets it. Think of the mind as a river. When the water flows smoothly, the riverbed is calm. But when the river is blocked by unseen debris, tension builds, currents twist, and chaos emerges. The mind does the same. Even when the river of life is clear, unseen patterns within the mind create turbulence. Thoughts are mistaken for truth. Worries are mistaken for threats. Anxiety rises because you believe every passing fear or doubt defines your reality. Comfort becomes unbearable because you have never learned to simply inhabit it. We suffer because we resist what is. We cling to control, demanding that life conform to our expectations. We mistake thoughts for identity, believing that every mental whisper defines who we are. We try to escape discomfort, and in doing so, we multiply it. In essence, suffering thrives not in external events, but in the mind's refusal to observe life as it unfolds. The more we fight reality, the louder our inner conflict becomes. The mind interprets silence as danger, comfort as suspicion, and freedom as uncertainty. The liberation from this suffering is deceptively simple. It begins with observation, not escape. It begins with the courage to sit with what arises, to watch thoughts and emotions without identifying with them, to see that fear, doubt, and tension are temporary visitors rather than permanent truths. In that space of awareness, the mind no longer demands that life be other than it is. Anxiety softens, restlessness dissolves, and the subtle weight of imagined problems lifts. You suffer when nothing is wrong because you have mistaken the mind's stories for reality. You have allowed fleeting thoughts to dictate your experience. You have forgotten that awareness, not reaction, is the source of freedom. The present moment, unfiltered by judgment or expectation, is always whole. It is always enough. And yet the mind drags you elsewhere, into past regrets, into future fears, into imagined crises that do not exist. The suffering that arises in these moments is not real in the sense of being externally caused. It is the echo of resistance, the shadow of untrained attention, the result of identifying with impermanence. Understanding this is not an intellectual exercise. It is a practice, a discipline of returning to presence, of witnessing the mind without attachment. It is noticing when fear rises, when anxiety blooms, when judgment intensifies, and simply observing without interference. Each moment of observation loosens the grip of suffering, showing that pain is often self-created, unnecessary, and entirely optional. In this awareness, you begin to recognize that nothing is truly wrong. Life is simply happening. You are simply present. The paradox is undeniable. The more we chase peace, the more we resist what is, the more we suffer. The more we observe without trying to fix, control, or escape, the freer we become. The mind, once recognized for what it is, loses its power to imprison. And in that realization, suffering, though it may arise, no longer has a home. Suffering is a peculiar thing. It often convinces us that it must have a cause, that it must arise from some tangible problem, some circumstance gone wrong, or some failure that demands correction. We search for the source, scanning our lives for mistakes, conflicts, or unmet desires, as if suffering is always a signal of something external needing repair. Yet often, suffering exists independently of circumstance. It can appear when the body is healthy, the mind is safe, and the world around us is calm. It is not always born of visible chaos, and it does not always come as a reaction to external loss. Sometimes, it emerges simply because we are alive, because the mind is restless, because the habitual patterns of thought have not been trained to rest in the present moment. We assume that comfort and safety should naturally bring peace, and when they do not, we judge ourselves, believing something must be wrong. This judgment is itself a layer of suffering. We ask ourselves why we feel uneasy, why dissatisfaction lingers, and why anxiety rises when there is nothing to provoke it. Yet the truth is that the mind does not need external conflict to create tension. It is capable of generating fear, doubt, and despair out of nothing, simply by running ahead into imagined futures, replaying imagined failures, or clinging to memories of imagined wrongs. The mind has a tendency to project, to fabricate, and to dramatize. It thrives on movement, on creating a story where there may be none. Suffering often arises not from reality itself, but from resistance to reality. When life is unfolding in ordinary, unremarkable ways, the mind may still find friction. It may rebel against the quiet, the ordinary, the uneventful, as though calmness itself is a threat. This is because the mind has been trained, through habit and culture, to equate peace with stagnation, stillness with emptiness, and comfort with something suspicious. In this subtle mistrust, the mind invents trouble to fill the void, as though suffering is a necessary companion. We are so accustomed to identifying ourselves with tension that we feel incomplete without it, so much so that peace can feel like a stranger, and contentment can feel shallow or fleeting. This is why people often suffer most when nothing is outwardly wrong. It is not that the world has become difficult, but that the mind has not been trained to inhabit simplicity. Suffering in these moments is not a signal from the universe demanding action. It is a reflection of the mind's lack of discipline, the absence of awareness, the habit of turning ordinary life into a drama. When the mind is untrained, it does not simply observe, it judges, compares, fears, and anticipates. Every moment becomes a potential source of disappointment, a potential confirmation that something is missing. In this sense, suffering is self-perpetuating, fed not by reality, but by the refusal to allow reality to exist as it is. It is also worth noting that suffering without an external cause often arises from the mind's tendency to chase meaning. We want life to feel significant, and when it does not, we interpret the emptiness as a problem. Even in moments of abundance or ease, we may feel incomplete, restless, or dissatisfied. The mind confuses this restlessness for evidence of wrongness, and we respond with worry, self-criticism, or attempts at control. We may seek distractions, accomplishments, or validations, thinking they will fill the unseen gap. Yet the gap is not in life, it is in the mind. The mind, untrained and unobserved, creates the sensation of lack out of nothing at all. Understanding that suffering does not require a problem changes the way we relate to ourselves and our experiences. It allows us to see that the discomfort we feel is not a verdict on our lives, nor a reflection of failure, nor an indication of neglect. It is often the mind speaking in its habitual language, telling a story that has no basis in present reality. Recognizing this opens the possibility of stepping back from thought, of observing the mind without judgment, and of discovering that the experience of suffering can exist without reason, and can also dissolve without reason. Silence is often considered a luxury, a rare gift in a world full of noise. We seek it in moments of solitude, in quiet spaces away from the business of daily life, believing that peace will naturally arise in the absence of distraction. Yet silence is paradoxical. For many, the absence of external stimulus does not bring calm, but instead amplifies the inner noise that is always present, but often drowned out by activity. The mind does not rest simply because the world has grown quiet. On the contrary, silence can become a stage upon which the mind performs all its fears, doubts, regrets, and anticipations, revealing the constant chatter that underlies ordinary life. When there is nothing pressing to occupy attention, the mind begins to fill the space with its habitual patterns. Thoughts long ignored or suppressed rise to the surface. Concerns about the future, recollections of the past, judgments about oneself and others, all emerge with startling clarity. The quieter the external environment, the louder the inner dialogue becomes, as though silence itself is a mirror reflecting the mind's restlessness. It is in these moments that one may notice how rarely the mind is truly at peace, how rarely it simply observes without interference, and how often it interprets reality through the lens of anxiety or desire. The noise of the mind in silence is not random. It follows patterns cultivated over a lifetime. We carry with us memories of failure, disappointment, and loss, and in quiet moments, these memories are replayed and magnified. We imagine futures that may never come to pass, scenarios of danger, rejection, or inadequacy. we debate within ourselves, seeking solutions to problems that do not yet exist or may never exist. Each thought seems important, urgent, and true, yet it is often a construct of habit rather than a reflection of reality. The mind, unobserved, does not distinguish between truth and story. It treats imagination as fact and speculation as certainty, allowing anxiety to flourish in the emptiness left by silence. This inner noise is further intensified by the mind's attachment to meaning. In silence, the lack of external input can feel threatening because it challenges the mind's habitual need for stimulation. The human mind has evolved to seek patterns, explanations, and narratives, and when the external world does not provide them, the mind generates its own. Questions of purpose, self-worth, and significance rise to the surface. Even in the absence of external conflict, we may feel tension simply because the mind is trying to organize reality into a story that satisfies its need for coherence. Silence exposes this need, revealing the extent to which our inner peace has been dependent on distraction, activity, and noise. The phenomenon of mental noise in silence also demonstrates how little control we have over our thoughts. We like to believe that thinking is voluntary and that we can direct it at will. But in truth, thoughts often arise unbidden, propelled by habit and conditioning. In moments of quiet, this lack of control becomes apparent. We try to force our minds into calmness, only to find that resistance creates more agitation. Efforts to suppress the noise often make it louder, as if the mind resists being denied its habitual patterns. This dynamic illustrates a fundamental truth. The mind is not naturally quiet, and silence is not a cure. It is a mirror, reflecting both the restlessness and the creative capacity of thought. The challenge, then, is not to eliminate mental noise, but to observe it without judgment, to witness the chatter of the mind without becoming entangled in it. Silence can be a teacher, revealing the depth of habit, the persistence of attachment, and the ways in which we interpret reality through patterns of thought rather than direct experience. By observing the noise, we begin to see that it is not reality itself that disturbs us, but our reaction to it, our identification with it, and our tendency to treat every passing thought as urgent and true. In this sense, silence is both revealing and liberating. It exposes the mind's constant activity, allowing us to notice its tendencies, while also offering the possibility of stepping back from identification with every thought. In quiet moments, we can begin to distinguish between the mind's stories and the reality that exists beyond them. The noise in silence, though uncomfortable at first, can become a doorway to awareness, inviting a deeper understanding of how the mind operates, how suffering is generated, and how peace is always available beneath the chatter, if one is willing to observe without interference. Human beings have a natural desire for stability, predictability, and certainty. From the earliest moments of life, we learn to seek patterns and to try to influence our environment in ways that feel safe and familiar. This desire is not inherently wrong. It is a survival mechanism, a way for the mind to navigate a world full of unknowns. Yet when this desire becomes an attachment, a need to control every outcome, every circumstance, every thought, it becomes the source of deep inner conflict. The more we cling to the idea that life must unfold according to our plan, the more we resist the natural flow of change, and the more suffering we generate within ourselves. Control, in its essence, is the attempt to impose order on reality, to make life conform to our expectations. When the world behaves as we wish, we feel comfort and reassurance. But life is rarely so compliant. People change, events unfold unpredictably, and circumstances shift in ways we cannot anticipate. When we are attached to control, each deviation from our expectations becomes a source of frustration, disappointment, or fear. The mind interprets the unpredictability of life as a threat to its stability, and in this resistance, tension is born. We become trapped in a constant struggle, striving to direct what is inherently undirected, and in this striving, we lose the ease and clarity that could otherwise exist. This inner conflict is subtle and persistent. It does not always manifest as obvious anger or distress. Sometimes it appears as low-level anxiety, irritability, or a vague sense of dissatisfaction. Even in moments of apparent success, the mind can remain unsettled, because the attachment to control is not about achieving specific outcomes, but about the illusion of certainty itself. We may accomplish a goal, gain recognition, or secure comfort. And yet the mind continues to worry about what could go wrong next. The desire for control is never satiated because life is never fully controllable, and the mind mistakes its unease as evidence that something is wrong, rather than recognizing it as the natural consequence of attachment. This attachment extends beyond external events to our internal world. We try to control our emotions, forcing ourselves to feel happy, calm, or confident, and we attempt to suppress anxiety, sadness, or fear. We control our thoughts, striving to think positively or avoid undesirable ideas. While some degree of self-regulation is necessary for functioning, when this regulation becomes rigid or obsessive, it creates conflict. The very act of resisting what naturally arises, emotions, impulses, uncertainty, generates tension. The mind rebels against suppression, creating a push and pull that is exhausting and unending. The harder we try to impose order on our inner world, the more friction we experience. Attachment to control also distorts relationships. We attempt to influence others, to dictate behavior, or to anticipate reactions, believing that our sense of safety depends on others conforming to our expectations. This creates strain, resentment, and disappointment, both in ourselves and in those around us. Relationships, like life, are inherently fluid and dynamic, yet attachment to control imposes rigidity, undermining the natural give and take of human interaction. Conflict arises not from the other person, but from our insistence that the world bend to our will. Freedom, by contrast, emerges when we loosen this attachment. When we recognize that life cannot be fully controlled, we can begin to relinquish the need to force outcomes. This does not mean apathy or passivity. It means aligning effort with reality rather than against it, observing the flow of events without insisting that they conform to expectation. By releasing the illusion of control, we reduce internal friction and allow clarity, creativity, and adaptability to arise. We become capable of responding rather than reacting, of engaging rather than resisting, and of finding peace in the midst of uncertainty. The conflict created by attachment to control is often invisible until it is observed with attention. In moments of quiet reflection, one can notice the tension in the body, the racing of the mind, or the subtle worry about the future. These sensations are indicators of the attachment at work, reminders that control is being demanded where it is not possible. Recognizing this allows a shift in perspective, from the insistence on bending life to one's will to the gentle art of acceptance, from struggle to responsiveness, from tension to ease. The paradox is clear: the more we cling to control, the more we suffer. The more we release it, the more life unfolds naturally, and the less inner conflict we experience. It is not external events that create tension, but the mind's insistence on imposing its patterns upon what is inherently free, fluid, and unpredictable. Comfort is often mistaken for ease, a state where the mind and body can rest without tension. We assume that when our basic needs are met, when life is free from immediate danger or difficulty, a natural sense of peace will arise. Yet for many, this is not the case. Comfort can paradoxically become a source of anxiety, unease, or restlessness, and the cause of this transformation lies in untrained awareness. The mind, accustomed to seeking challenges, identifying threats, or striving for achievement, often cannot simply inhabit moments of ease without interpreting them, judging them, or projecting into them. In other words, when awareness has not been trained to observe without interference, comfort is filtered through patterns of expectation, worry, and habit, and what should be a reprieve can become a breeding ground for anxiety. When we are uncomfortable or under pressure, the mind is engaged. It identifies danger, analyzes problems, and mobilizes effort. There is a purpose to discomfort. It directs attention and fuels action. In contrast, comfort removes this external stimulus, leaving a space that the mind must now fill. If the mind has not been trained to rest in awareness, to observe sensations, emotions, and thoughts without judgment, it will inevitably generate its own activity. It will question, anticipate, and evaluate. The absence of struggle, which might seem like liberation, becomes confusing and unfamiliar, triggering the very anxiety we associate with threat. We feel restless because the mind is unpracticed in inhabiting stillness, and it instinctively seeks tension where none exists. This phenomenon is further compounded by attachment to outcomes and identity. In moments of comfort, the mind may ask questions like, is this real? Will it last? Do I deserve this? Every small sense of ease can become a source of doubt. The mind, untrained in mindful observation, interprets comfort as temporary, fragile, or suspicious, and anxiety arises as a way of attempting to regain control. We worry preemptively, anticipating that the calm will be interrupted, the security lost, or the situation spoiled. In this way, comfort is never fully experienced because the mind continuously overlays it with imagined instability or potential harm. Untrained awareness also amplifies subtle discomforts that might otherwise go unnoticed. In a state of ease, minor bodily sensations, fleeting emotions, or passing thoughts are magnified because the mind has no pressing problem to focus on. A small tension in the shoulder, a trace of sadness, or a brief memory of past failure can dominate attention. Without the skill of observation, these minor disturbances are interpreted as meaningful, urgent, or threatening, converting an otherwise ordinary state of comfort into an internal struggle. Anxiety, in this sense, is not born of the external world, but of the mind's habit of evaluating, interpreting, and predicting. Cultural conditioning and personal habit further reinforce this pattern. We are often taught to value struggle, to glorify achievement, and to fear stagnation. Comfort, when untrained awareness encounters it, may feel undeserved, suspicious, or unproductive. The mind interprets the absence of effort as a potential loss, an erosion of capability, or a signal of impending failure. Even when there is no objective threat, the internal narrative spins a story that engages the same neural pathways as real danger, and the body responds with tension, racing thoughts, and a subtle sense of alarm. In essence, comfort becomes anxiety because the mind is unaccustomed to simply witnessing the present without interference. Training awareness, by contrast, allows comfort to be inhabited without distortion. With observation, the mind can recognize that ease is not a problem, that presence does not require judgment, and that momentary stillness is not a threat. The subtle tension that arises in comfort can be seen for what it is, a transient thought, a passing emotion, a habit of interpretation, rather than as evidence of instability. The mind learns to witness without reacting, to experience without projecting, and to rest without creating need. Anxiety loses its foothold when awareness is cultivated, because there is no longer a gap for imagined threats or stories to fill. The paradox of comfort and untrained awareness is clear. Ease itself does not create anxiety, yet the untrained mind insists on interpreting, resisting, or predicting. What should be simple becomes complicated, what should be restful becomes restless, and the very state of safety or abundance becomes fertile ground for unease. By observing the mind without identification, by allowing sensations, thoughts, and emotions to arise and pass without interference, comfort can be restored to its natural function, a space for presence, for clarity, and for freedom. Human beings have an extraordinary capacity for thought. The mind constantly generates ideas, interpretations, memories, judgments, and imaginings. Thoughts arise spontaneously, flowing like a river, often unnoticed until they demand attention. Yet there is a subtle trap embedded in this natural activity, the tendency to mistake thought for identity. We come to believe that every thought we have is an expression of who we are, that the inner voice that comments, critiques, or imagines defines our essential self. This identification with thought is a source of deep suffering because it convinces us that the impermanent, fleeting, and often contradictory content of the mind is reality itself. From early life, we are conditioned to trust our thoughts as guides. We learn to think logically, to evaluate experiences, and to reason about the world. While this capacity is essential for navigating life, it creates the illusion that we are our thoughts. When a negative thought arises, we believe it reflects a flaw in our character. When a worry surfaces, we take it as a signal of inadequacy. When a judgment of another appears, we assume it reveals the truth about ourselves or them. In each case, the mind presents temporary content, and we treat it as permanent, treating a passing mental event as the foundation of our being. This identification has profound consequences for emotional life. If a thought of failure arises, we feel shame, as though the thought is a declaration of our worth. If a thought of fear or danger emerges, we experience anxiety, as though our safety or competence depends on the accuracy of that thought. Even pleasant thoughts, when mistaken for identity, can trap us in the pursuit of gratification, attachment, or validation, because we believe that satisfaction of these thoughts will affirm who we are. The problem is that thoughts are transient. They arise, change, and disappear without our control, yet we cling to them as if they were unchanging markers of self. The confusion between thought and identity also distorts perception of the external world. We interpret events, other people, and circumstances through the lens of our thoughts, and we assume that these interpretations are objective reality. A single judgment about a colleague, friend, or situation is treated as an irrefutable truth. A fleeting impression of inadequacy or fear is perceived as a fact rather than a passing state. The mind, unobserved, layers its stories upon reality, and we mistake these stories for the totality of experience. We believe we know ourselves, others, and life itself, when in truth we are navigating a world filtered through the shifting currents of thought. This misidentification also fuels attachment and aversion. When we believe that a thought defines us, we cling to thoughts that feel positive, validating, or desirable, and we resist those that feel negative, threatening, or uncomfortable. The inner voice becomes a tyrant, commanding attention, dictating mood, and shaping behavior. Every judgment, fear, or aspiration feels urgent, as though it must be acted upon to preserve or enhance identity. Anxiety, frustration, and conflict arise naturally from this relentless pressure to defend or maintain a self that is, in reality, a construct of passing mental content. Freedom begins when thought is seen for what it is, a transient phenomenon, a visitor in consciousness rather than the foundation of being. Awareness allows the distinction between the observer and the observed, between the self that notices and the thoughts that arise. When a thought is observed without identification, it loses the power to dominate, to dictate mood, or to define reality. A critical thought can appear and disappear without diminishing the sense of presence. A fearful thought can arise and pass without dictating action. The observer recognizes the mind's activity, while remaining untouched by its fluctuating content, and the illusion that thought is identity gradually dissolves. This shift transforms experience. Life becomes less reactive and more spacious. Emotions are experienced fully, without being automatically colored by judgments about the self. Actions are guided by clarity, rather than compulsive thought patterns. Relationships are less contaminated by projections, assumptions, or insecurities. Even when difficult or disturbing thoughts arise, they are no longer taken as evidence of permanent defect or inadequacy. Instead, they are simply part of the continuous flow of consciousness, ephemeral and non-defining. The confusion between thought and identity is deeply ingrained and often subtle. It can be reinforced by culture, education, and personal history, all of which emphasize the importance of reasoning, reflection, and self-concept. Yet the truth is simple thoughts are not who we are. They are temporary expressions within the mind, and the essence of self exists as the awareness that observes them, unchanged by their coming and going. When this is realized, the mind no longer imposes its stories on life, and suffering rooted in identification with thought begins to loosen its grip. Human beings naturally seek freedom, yet the path to it is often misunderstood. Many believe that freedom is attained by escaping discomfort, avoiding difficulty, or controlling circumstances so that nothing threatens peace. We imagine that if we could remove obstacles, shield ourselves from pain, or secure a predictable life, liberation would follow. Yet this approach is a form of flight, and flight cannot create freedom. True freedom does not lie in altering the outside world, nor in evading the present moment, but in cultivating the capacity to observe what is occurring without resistance. Observation, not escape, is the doorway to liberation, because it allows reality to reveal itself without distortion, and it allows the mind to awaken from habitual patterns that perpetuate suffering. Escape, by contrast, is an attempt to avoid what is uncomfortable or uncertain. It may take the form of distraction, business, compulsive planning, or mental fabrication. The mind becomes occupied with the past or the future, seeking refuge from the sensations, emotions, or thoughts that arise in the present. While escape can provide temporary relief, it cannot dissolve the underlying tension, because the moment we stop fleeing, the same discomfort reemerges. In truth, the desire to escape is fueled by identification with thought, attachment to outcomes, and the belief that peace exists somewhere else, beyond what is directly experienced. This pattern reinforces a subtle imprisonment. We become captive to our attempts to avoid, rather than learning to inhabit what is. Observation, on the other hand, does not seek to remove or alter experience. It simply acknowledges what arises, whether it is thought, emotion, or sensation, without judgment or interference. In observing, the mind ceases to insist that reality conform to its preferences. We see fear as fear, anger as anger, joy as joy, without clinging or rejection. We notice thoughts as they come and go, recognizing them as temporary phenomena rather than as definitive statements about ourselves or the world. Through observation, we learn that no thought, feeling, or circumstance has the power to define our inner state unless we grant it that power. In this way, observation cultivates freedom because it restores the ability to respond consciously rather than react compulsively. The practice of observation also illuminates the habitual patterns that bind the mind. When we attempt escape, we are often unaware of the unconscious drives motivating us, the desire to be understood, to be safe, to control, or to avoid discomfort. Observation brings these patterns into awareness. We can see how thoughts spin stories, how emotions amplify in the absence of attention, and how resistance to what is creates suffering. Simply noticing these dynamics without immediately intervening interrupts the cycle of compulsion. The mind begins to recognize its own tendencies and learns to relax its grip. In this subtle relaxation, the sensation of freedom emerges naturally, not as a goal to be achieved, but as a natural byproduct of presence. Freedom through observation also requires acceptance, not resignation. Acceptance is not passive acquiescence. It is the willingness to see reality clearly as it is, without imposing interpretation or judgment. This clarity allows discernment. Action can arise when it is necessary, effort can be applied skillfully, and response can be guided by insight rather than fear. Escape, by contrast, operates through avoidance, cutting us off from the direct experience of life and limiting our ability to engage meaningfully. When we observe rather than flee, we inhabit life fully, even in the midst of difficulty, and the mind discovers that it is not threatened by the unfolding of events. Another subtle aspect of observation is the cultivation of detachment. Detachment is not indifference. It is the recognition that we are not the thoughts, emotions, or circumstances that pass through awareness. In observing without identification, we create a space in which freedom can arise. The mind is no longer enslaved by habitual reactions or the need for control. Anxiety, craving, and aversion lose their power because they are no longer reinforced by unconscious identification. The freedom discovered in observation is internal and unassailable, because it depends not on external conditions but on the ability to witness them with clarity. Observation, therefore, transforms the relationship with life itself. Instead of seeing the world as something to be manipulated, avoided, or escaped, we begin to perceive it as a field of experience to be noticed with openness. Each thought, emotion, or sensation becomes an opportunity for awareness, and in this awareness, the mind finds a natural ease that no escape can provide. Freedom is revealed not in the absence of difficulty, but in the ability to meet it with clear, unresisting attention, and in the recognition that the mind itself is the source of liberation when it ceases to flee